Is there a good place for us to start with the podcast, and if there's specific things we should be asking about?
We can. You can ask me about my background and this stuff and how I got in a position to write the book and stuff. I guess.
Sounds good.
Mhm.
You ready, Valentino?
Yep.
All right. I'm going to kick off the show then. Hey, folks. Welcome back to another episode of the Ruby Rogues podcast. This week on our panel, we have Valentino Stoll.
Hey now.
I'm Charles Max Wood from Top End Devs. We have a special guest this week, and it is Obie Fernandez. Obie, it's been a while. How are things going?
Pretty good, man. Thanks for the invite. It's an honor to be back.
Yeah. So do you want to just, I know you're writing an AI book, and I see you active in the Ruby AI Discord, but what else are you up to? What else should people know about you?
Well, I've been living mostly in Mexico City since 2017, so people usually find that interesting and ask me what that's about, because I grew up outside New York City and spent 20 years in Atlanta, in the Southeast U.S. But yeah, Mexico City is super cool. It's a great place for expats to live. Great lifestyle. And I've done a couple startups in recent years. One was an NFT platform that kind of took me and 100 other employees on a big roller coaster ride with venture backing, and then crashed and burned, along with the rest of the crypto market a couple of years ago. So that was interesting. And for the last year, I've been working on another startup called Olympia, which is a platform that gives you AI-powered consultants to add to your team. It's kind of humanizes AI. So yeah, that's been a lot. That's been a lot of fun, and it's doing well. It's growing about 10-20% month on month. So
oh wow,
that doesn't seem to be letting up.
Good deal.
I love Olympia.
Oh, right.
I'm a happy user here.
Oh, super cool. I didn't actually realize that. That's a surprise. That's awesome.
So where did you find it? Just olympia.com or something?
Olympia.chat.
.chat. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I need to bite the bullet and spend on the AI or .com domain name there, but they're expensive.
Yeah. Well, I'll have to check it out. In the meantime, I kind of want to get back to the book, that you're writing about AI and Ruby, and I'm kind of curious. It sounds like you've been working in this for a while, but how did you get started with this? And what have you done that makes you the guy to write this book?
Well, this isn't my first startup that I've tried to do in AI. So like back in 2018, 2019, as a side project at Kick-Ass Partners, which was my consulting company that I merged with Magma Labs back in 2020. I did a project called Demos Guru, and the idea is, so I'm also involved in music and music production and so on, and was running a somewhat active record label at the time as a hobby. So one of the problems that I identified for myself and other people that run record labels is that you get this flood of demos that have nothing to do with the kind of music you put out, or they're just not up to par in different ways, not mixed properly and whatnot. And I didn't actually realize that machine learning stuff was a craze back in that era, 2018, 2019. I was just reading some analysis of it, and I don't know, maybe COVID scrambled my brain, but I thought it was pretty unique. What I was thinking of doing back then is like basically trying to use machine learning to detect different qualities of a piece of music, including its genre, mastering, quality of its mastering and mixing, and then other things that you could use to identify the music. So worked on that for nearly a year. Didn't get anywhere. Really hard math, and just kind of difficult problem that wasn't cracked yet. I'm not sure that it's cracked yet right now, actually, now that I think about it. I haven't really thought about it in a while, but the people are doing the reverse, which is taking text, and turning it into music. And I was trying to take music and turn it into text, which I haven't seen yet. So if anyone's working on that, reach out to me. I'm super interested in it. But we were talking about Olympia, right? Like a year ago, I started working on this startup. Actually, it goes before that. So the last RailsConf I went to, which was the first RailsConf in a while, was in Atlanta last year. And I was super excited about launching like a ChatGPT clone in Rails at the time. So I scrambled and I made a little platform called MagnaChat, and I open sourced it during RailsConf and kind of announced it. I showed it to a bunch of people. Even at that even at the RailsConf, I mean, a lot of people I was showing it to had never seen ChatGPT yet because it was still recently new, fairly recent. They wanted to know what's going on. So blew some minds just in terms of showing people what you could do with GPT-4. And then my girlfriend kept complaining about her copywriter at work. So she was running partnerships for a large conference series. And she had this copywriter in India who was paid very little money and produced very low quality copywriting. So she was rewriting everything. And I said, well, hey, I got this MagnaChat thing deployed. Can I make you a copywriter bot? And she said, sure. And then I gave it to her and I watched her use it. And she's just started using this thing for hours a day. And basically started doing all her copywriting herself. And then very soon thereafter, she said, can you make me a whole editorial team? And I said, well, what do you need? And she said, give me a copy editor, give me an SEO expert, give me a marketing expert, give me a PR expert. So I put it together and very quickly realized, okay, there's got to be a startup here, because she was willing to pay for it. And I started showing it to other people and they were interested in paying for it. So I said, do you want to be my CEO? Because I was CEO of my last startup and I hated it. I'm more of a natural CTO, as you might imagine. So I brought her on board and we started Olympia together. And I had a beta product ready in a couple months. We launched it in July into closed beta, and then we launched to the public in September. And it's not using Python or TypeScript or any of the typical usual suspects you'd want to use for something like this, or you'd expect to use. Wrote in Rails right from the beginning. Kind of forked MagnaChat when I started, and then eventually ended up replacing almost all of it. Have not done a good job of keeping MagnaChat up to date. Sorry, whoever picked that up. Really screwed you over on that. But my partners at MagnaLab have also kind of forked from where I started, and they have a commercial version of MagnaChat that they'll implement for people, behind the firewall kind of thing. So, you were asking about the book. I mean, essentially, I took notes, given I've written technical books before, as you know.
Just a few.
So, I was taking notes along the way, and right from the beginning, I was like, wow, this is, to me, completely novel kinds of programming. It's just a totally new paradigm in the way, just things I haven't seen before. So I was like, okay, I started documenting what were essentially patterns and approaches and things. And I guess I did a little bit of blogging about it as well. I mean, some of the early blogging I did on the subject went viral. When the topic is so hot, like the D&D post I did for AI got hundreds of thousands of reads on Medium. So that was kind of insane.
D&D.
And so that was what first hooked me on it. So like when I first got access to the OpenAI API, My kids were actually here, so I have a 27-year-old daughter and a 24-year-old son, and a now 16-year-old son. And the 16-year-old is really into Dungeons and Dragons. And as a family, we did a lot of gaming growing up as well.
Mm-hmm.
So they were here for spring break, or I guess it wasn't spring break. Oh, I guess it was like a late holiday break. I can't remember exactly, but they were all here in Mexico City. We were all here at the same time. We were playing Dungeons and Dragons. And I said, hey, I bet you that this AI thing could be a good DM for a role-playing game. And then so I started playing around with it, and I tried to make an app for it, and then I described it in a blog post. And that blog post blew up really big. And I started getting that like spidey sense of like, okay, here's another big wave to ride,
So, go ahead, Valentino.
Oh no, I mean I have a lot to say here.
Yeah, so do I.
I mean I love the Dungeons and Dragons use case, which is kind of interesting now with ChatGPT's like multimodality, like just talking with it. I had like a long car ride recently where I was just like talking through a business idea, and it's pretty remarkable. But yeah, I mean the whole Magma Chat stuff, I love that. It was actually really inspirational, like for how to use AI in a lot of ways. And so you're out there wondering, like, that's definitely like a great place to start to just like pick apart how to do XYZ. Until your book comes out, because a lot of that is conveyed in there.
Well, the book's available. We'll talk. You can get it right now on LeanPub, and there's actually much better code out there now than Magma Chat. So if you're listening to this, don't go use Magma Chat. Use Ray for Rails or one of the other newer, kind of things for this. But thanks.
I mean, I'd love to chat through some of the just the concepts in there. We don't have to talk about the details of it, but right. Like, kind of just like giving memory to like agents, right? Which I thought was really interesting idea, and because a lot of people think like, to your point of like, making a copywriter or a Dungeon Dragons master, right? Like these are all kind of like just roles. And a lot of people think, like you could just do that with ChatGPT, give it a system message or precluding user message and just say, hey, you're now this role. Like, and a lot of people just say, okay, well, why would you need any other service or any other like, advanced thing where ChatGPT is just going to do that for you? Like, what are you doing on top of that, right? Like, what is because there's like a lot of like,
the key insight there, which is really the foundation of why me and many other people can do startups on this stuff, is that prompt engineering to us as programmers seems like no big deal. It's just how you use the tool. But to a normal person who's not a programmer, it really, really seems like programming, which means they're not interested in doing it or not very good at it. It's just not the way their brain works. So when you give them an option, like our profile at Olympia, like our heaviest power users that we've interviewed, a lot of them are non-technical. They're not programmers. They are early adopters. They're very excited by the technology and they follow it religiously. But they're not so interested in learning the intricacies and ins and outs of prompt engineering. And I mean, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I kind of want to bring it up a level or two because, we went right into kind of the GPT large language model and, and chat GPT like things and prompt engineering. And so I'm just wondering, as far as, your book and some of these other things, is that the scope of your book, is covering that stuff? And maybe you don't go into things like transcriptions with Whisper or, computer vision or things like that. And the other question that I have is that where people can jump in, and how do they do that? Right. Because I want to make it very approachable for people to go, this is okay, I'm going to do AI. This is where I jump in. And I don't know if prompt engineering is the way to go. And anyway.
So here's my answer to that. And the thing that kind of tipped me over into like, okay, I should start this book now, was that an old friend of mine, Tom Mornini, who might be listening to the show, we were at a conference. I was giving a talk on AI, and he was in the audience, and he raised his hand at the end of the talk and said, "Where do I get started? Like, this is all so overwhelming." And that was the spark where I was like, okay, I got to start working on this. And I literally started working on the way home on the flight, and then just dedicated a huge amount of hours to trying to get as much done as possible on it as quickly as possible. The reason is my belief, and I'm not sure how many other people necessarily share this, but I mean, I think it's starting to spread, is that you don't have to start an AI project in order to use this stuff. Like, you don't have to have like an idea for an AI startup or something like that. Like, almost everyone who's currently maintaining or developing an application on Ruby on Rails can probably get some benefit from taking a particularly complex part of their code and dropping in a discrete AI component to handle it. So that
do you have an example?
So the example that I like using, so okay, anything that involves user generated content, for instance.
You mean like a blog?
Like a blog with comments and whatnot. And I realize that there's services that you can use to do what I'm about to describe. But I mean, basically anything that involves evaluation of user generated content, right now you can do very, very easily with using large language models and and existing APIs. That's kind of a no-brainer use case. But what I go into the book, and I've been using it as an example in talks and whatnot, is that you can actually take parts of your code that are implemented in code, but if you had a little person that you could stick into your code, then you might want to use a little person instead. So in Olympia, the example I give is the example of the account manager class. And the account manager class handles a few different operations involving changing a customer's account, most notably adding an assistant to your account. So internally, in the user interface, this works with a button. So like you look through a catalog of users that are available to add. We call them clones, yada yada. But when the user presses that button internally, the internal API uses plain language. The internal API tells the account manager, user with this ID would like to add this bot config with this ID to their account. And if I here, I'll just pull up the actual prompt so I can read it to you.
So it sounds like, though, you've got some form of interaction that I, as your user, do, and that triggers essentially a prompt to be sent, right? It's not this explicit function or method call that does.
There's a component in my app which has the role of account manager, and it has a selection of functions that it can call. And those functions can mutate the customer's account. Right. It also has functions for communicating with the customer or with an account service rep or both. And it also has a finalize, because the request is encapsulated in a change request object, which is tracked in the database. So when it's done handling the change request, it calls finalize, which persists that along with the transcript of what happened. But it gives you a tremendous amount of flexibility. And also it saves you time, development time. So I wrote this very, very quickly. I mean, once you identify the pattern, you start wanting to look for places to use it. And then the prompt reads like the requirements for the code.
Okay.
Right. So the way that you describe this, I think it's okay to do this on a podcast. I mean, people are listening. So this is the prompt for my account manager component. Okay. You are an account manager for Olympia, a platform that provides AI-powered consultants and personal AI clones. Your role is to assist Olympia clone owners by answering their questions, helping them configure and manage their AI clones, and executing tasks related to the clones in Olympia platform. That itself is an approach or pattern that's described in the book. You're basically giving a role to the AI. So, and then now here come the instructions. When interacting with clone owners, you should provide clear, concise, helpful responses to their inquiries about account management, billing, platform features, and clone configuration. The reason I can do that is because I give it functions to be able to look up that information and convey it to the customer. Assist with tasks such as initiating client conversations with their AI clones, modifying. Oh, I think I picked up the wrong one. I'm reading the prompt from the clone manager, not the account manager. Let me take a step back for a second. I think if you're listening to what I was just saying, you kind of get the gist of it. You can give instructions to these things. There's another one which has smaller scope. This one's to help specifically with people that run clones on Olympia. There's one that is an account manager for regular customers. And one thing it can do is add a particular bot config to your account. We rolled this out, and within a week and a half, JP, our customer service guy, goes, "Hey, we have a problem with the clone adding. Someone added a clone and their account is inactive. Would you like me to create a Notion story for it?" And I opened the code while I was chatting with him in Slack about it, and I looked at it and I said, "No, I think I got it." And I added in a statement to the prompt, which said only allow addition of bot configs if your account is active. I literally just typed that into the prompt of the account manager.
Interesting.
You get what I'm saying?
Uh-huh.
I didn't have to add a conditional to the code, or extra checks or unit tests or anything.
Modify your pundit scope or your pundit rules.
Yeah. I literally just enhanced the instructions to the account manager and did a quick manual test, and it worked, and we're good to go. And in fact, if you think about what you would do traditionally with that, like you might, if you have a state which is invalid like that, then you might have to actually write an email template for it, in a mailer and whatnot. And in this case, you don't, because it's instructed to communicate with the user and let it know what happened with the operation. So if their account is not active and it doesn't add the bot config, it will send them an email and say, "Sorry, your account's not active, so I couldn't do the thing you asked me to do."
So going back to the idea of getting started, then, I mean, is this the kind of thing you're encouraging people to get started with? Is just open up ChatGPT and start writing prompts? And
it doesn't use ChatGPT. It uses the API, and there are I have my own framework called Ray, and there's other frameworks for how to use this. You could you could go at it at different abstraction levels, right? So, I mean, but for the most part, you need to understand the chat completion operation. So this concept of you give a system directive that kind of sets the stage for what you want the AI to do, and then you have a conversation with it where you say something and then they say something and then you respond, so on and so forth. So you have to understand that modality. You can engage with that modality at a couple different levels of abstraction. Those abstraction layers are provided to you by a library. So for instance, Ray, the one that I described in the book. And I mean, you could go whole hog, which is how I would characterize the account manager example I've been talking about. But you can also do much smaller things. So like one of the patterns in the book is the predicate pattern, and that's just a small component that answers a question yes or no. we answer yes/no questions all the time in our code, but they're usually very, very narrow scope. And if they're not narrow scope, then they tend to be brittle or difficult to maintain, because pretty much any unanticipated state will break it, right? And one of the great things about AI is that if you implement a component like this with an LLM backend, it can sometimes handle unexpected situations very, very smoothly.
Yep.
I think you bring up a great abstract point in it's a lot. See, there's a lot of people that are like, oh no, like, all this AI stuff is coming for my job in X, right? Like, and programmers for sure, like, like you see this and you're like, oh, why don't we just have a programmer bot and it takes requests and we just, chat to it and it'll, make our application for us, right? Like, which is not totally unreasonable, but is unreasonable in a lot of ways. And, hallucinations come to mind. Like, how do you make sure that the account manager, right, like, just doesn't start deleting things? And
Right.
there's like a rogue function that is created along the way, and now it's part of that tool chain. Like, I know there are a lot of checks that you can put in place, to prevent that kind of stuff, but a lot of it is just like getting natural language though brought to whatever that you are doing to complement it is how I've seen it work most effectively, which seems to be how you've kind of created your framework here for Ray, right? Whereas it's complementing the experience that you already have as a Rails developer,
right,
just making it easier to take advantage of this new tool, which is really AI. Do you see it that way, or do you also see like maybe it is coming for your job?
No, I don't think I don't think it's coming for any of our jobs anytime soon. And most recently I got access to something called GitHub Copilot Workspace. You got to sign up for it. There's a waiting list. It's a preview product where the interface is super cool, and like kind of the promise of it is super cool. Essentially, you attach it to your repo, and then you start a session, and in the session you go, I need to fix this issue, or I need to add this feature. And you describe what it is in plain language, and it scans the code, and then it comes up with a plan of action. So a checklist of like, I need to do this and this and this and this. I need to change this class, and so on and so forth. It kind of looks like what a disciplined developer would do when you sit down because you picked up a feature or an issue. So far so good. I was really impressed with that part. And then I said, okay, go, right? Like I asked it to change a particular class, and maybe I was too ambitious. I wanted it to refactor, three different very similar implementations into one thing. I don't want to get into bloody details, but so I had go, and then I thought about it for a while, and then I pulled up the code, and I saw the changes in action. So that part's super cool. And then it highlighted a bunch of the code, the existing code, and it deleted it. And then it put in a bunch of nonsensical methods to replace it that had nothing to do with what it was supposed to do. And I was most definitely underwhelmed. And now it is very, very possible that this works much better with Python and TypeScript. But it doesn't know the Rails way, that's for sure.
Right.
Because it was garbage. It was hot garbage. I tried to work with it a little bit, and said, no, this needs to get much better. And there are, I think, very credible reasons to think that it might not get that much better anytime soon. I mean, I think right now one of the lessons I've learned at Olympia is you have to throw a lot of brute force to get a usable result, in terms of these things being quote unquote intelligent and having memory and figuring out what you want and being able to recalibrate. And the reason I'm able to do that is thanks to the race to the bottom and the price of commodity AI models. So a lot of these open source models that you hear about, Mixtral and Llama 3 and Wizard LM from Microsoft, so on and so forth. So there's all these model providers competing to in this market for AI services, and they're driving the price to zero and the performance up. So that's great. You can access a lot of this stuff. And I do think that the price will keep dropping for a lot of these things to the point where it'll start to make sense to actually incorporate it into your runtime, like at the Rails level, and then maybe in the future at the Ruby level or even the virtual machine level for doing things like error recovery or, if you want to crank the dial up, like if you're okay with uncertainty and non-deterministic behavior, which some of us are, you can crank the dial up and have it do things like, cover for you if you give it the wrong type, or, try to automatically handle null pointers and, things like that. There's a lot of really interesting, magical, dangerous shit that I think we'll start getting into, as we get more comfortable with these technologies, and as the cost comes down, because right now the cost tends to be somewhat prohibitive, especially if you're using frontier models, which is what they call GPT-4 or Claude. But the smaller, faster models, man, they're so cheap. I mean, it's like 0.00004 cents, per request. Which for Olympia, at the scale that we're at is okay. That's a manageable bill. If you're a much bigger company, then maybe some of the things that I'm suggesting literally don't scale. I mean, they would end up costing you $1,000 a month or more.
On the topic of model choice, like I guess I have two questions around that. Like, how do you go about finding the right model for what you're trying to do? And how do you, like, what is that exploration process like?
What is the what process?
Like, what's the exploration process for
exploration,
like figuring out that model?
Well, I'm a big fan of a service called Open Router, and I wish I had an equity stake because I'm evangelizing them all the time. But they power a number of really popular AI-based services like Silly Tavern, and a new product that I'm using, which I'll plug, called Novel Crafter. They're super awesome. And the exploration process is basically going to Open Router's playground and being able to compare, run prompts in parallel and see what happens with different AI models. Basically saying, okay, here's GPT-4 as my benchmark, and then try to run the same thing against Llama 3 and Mixtral and whatever, and so on down the line. And the main reason I use Open Router, and I feature it in my in most of the open source I've done, half dozen open source things I've done, is that it's one API key, one endpoint, one account to manage and pay for, and it gives you access to everything. OpenAI, Claude, Gemini Pro, Cohere, like all the major models, and then a whole bunch of open source models, including ones you've never heard of, are available there. It's probably have a couple hundred now. And for the ones that are offered by multiple providers, so like the example of provider would be like GPT-4 is offered by OpenAI itself, but it's also offered by Azure. So one of the things I really like about Open Router is that if GPT-4 is down for whatever reason, it can automatically fail over to Azure, which means I don't have to have a Azure account, which is great because I don't like premature aging. So Azure is very, very difficult to set up and work with and everything like that. So but you were asking the selection process is trial and error. I mean, I think there's someone in the Ruby AI Discord that's working on I think it's called Prompt Garage or something like that, which gives you some sort of framework for for doing this in a methodical fashion. But it's pretty easy to, like, once you got it going, it's pretty easy to just plug in a model name and see if it works. And I do tend to TDD these things. I don't leave them in my suite, or if I do leave them in my suite, they're backed by VCR so that they run quick. But I do tend to TDD my AI components. So I'll just sit there and iterate, red, green until I get what I need. And one of those things that you change while you're trying to get it to work is the model. Trying to get the cheapest, fastest model that will consistently work.
So do you walk through this process in your book?
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah,
the whole first half of the book is kind of approaches, and then the second half of the book is like concrete. This is a pattern. This is the name of it. This is how you use it. Here's example code.
Yeah, I will say I haven't made my whole way through the book, but I've made a decent amount. And I do like how you keep reiterating on like the discrete components aspect of it, which I think is reflected well in your like Ray framework, right? Where you're just trying to, encapsulate whatever the task at hand is and keep things small. And I think that's kind of reflective of how the models work in general, is like you give it too much and it's going to make more mistakes, which I think is true of people too.
Yeah, I think of them like little people. There's a chapter in the book called Multitude of Workers, because that's the approach that I advocate. It's one way of thinking about it. It's like, if you had little people that you could put, not little people, but, if you had, little humanized bits of code, that you could give jobs, but they have to be narrow jobs at the moment. You're absolutely right, Valentino. You give these things too much surface area, too much to think about, and they mess up. The only model that I know right now that can reliably handle more than one or two tasks or functions, or just that kind of latitude, that kind of discretionary behavior, is GPT-4. Supposedly Opus from Claude can do it, but their tool, their framework for invoking functions is more mature. But like some of our bots in Olympia have 20, 24 functions available to them for every single request. So anytime you're talking to them, anytime you send them a prompt, they have 20 or more functions that they can call for things like checking system status, for sending email, for recalling things from memory, real-time search, Google search, image generation, so on and so forth. This is kind of like their palette, their tool belt of things that they can use to invoke. And there's, go ahead.
I'm curious, like the testing approach here, right? Like, does it start to like take a different shape than traditional web development, right? Like, is it more like, because once you get to the multitude of workers, right, and you have more than one, I could see like encapsulating one as like a thing, like maybe like a Rails model or something like that, and you have like unit tests that make sure that it says what you want it to in a certain format or whatever. But how does like the orchestration aspect, does that also translate the same way to like the controller flow, like to feature tests or something like that? Is there a parallel to that multitude of workers working together, or do you kind of just like, is that not really something worth doing?
I haven't gone too far down the rabbit hole in terms of trying to do automated tests for intelligent workflows. There's no reason that you wouldn't, if you were so inclined. Trying to think of how to intelligently answer that question. Speaking of a rabbit hole, I mean, you can start combining these things, and it can start getting pretty microservice feeling. I realized that a couple months ago. It started reminding me of some of the serverless approaches. Like I was really, really hot on microservices powered with Lambda when the serverless framework came out. So this is back like in 2015, timeframe, 2016. And I started writing a book on it. And it starts to feel like you have little microservices inside of your monolith when you incorporate these in Rails, because they have, you know, they have a very what I want to call it, the way you interact with them, like they're well encapsulated because they're black boxes. You know, you literally can only do input and output of messages with them. So I think it's cool. I mean, I love that approach, and I'm a hacker at heart. I started as a hacker when I was young, so I don't have a lot of hangups about like this has to be absolutely correct. And actually, I think you're probably a little too worried about hallucinations, Valentino, just from what it sounds like. Because for a lot of these use cases for discrete AI components, I mean, it is well since you've put a lot of constraints on what you want it to be, you know, what you want it to do, what kind of output you want it to give, and you crank the temperature parameter down to 0, which reduces the amount of creativity that the model, it like constrains the possible choices of the model down significantly.
That brings me to another question that I feel like I always get is like, you know, how do you find out what it's good at and what it isn't? Like, are there like definitive things, or is it kind of just like learn as you go aspects of it?
Well, I've definitely learned as I go. I mean, there's some things which are, I think, a little too meta. So like maybe I just haven't hit on the right way to do this, but like we do automated evaluations of the conversations in Olympia. And you said you're an Olympia user. So like basically there's a process that kicks off after a conversation idles for like 15, 20 minutes. And there's a component that will look at the conversation and give it a numerical grade up to 100. And say, this is what the bot did well, and this is what it did not so well. And if it drops below a certain number, then it gets flagged. And that goes to a dashboard so we can see kind of like the overall performance of the system. And also so we can be aware in case that user is having a lot of issues, then we can reach out to them and say, hey, it seems like you're having some issues with your Olympia assistance, you know, can we help? And what we find with these evaluations is that the model is very, very generous. It's like the nicest teacher you ever had. I mean, almost everyone gets 95. Doesn't matter how bad. Like the worst I've seen it get is 70. You know, and that's where everything was falling apart completely. And it's very kind and generous to itself, which is like kind of a weird thing to say, but you know, it's like the bot really, really tried. Yeah. So that I couldn't get to work right. I mean, there were other things. There used to be a lot of this has gotten better, and I think it's just mostly because GPT-4 has gotten better, but there used to be a lot of hallucinations around what we call stalling. So you'd ask your Olympia assistant to help you research something, and they'll say, on it, I'll get back to you in 3 hours. That's a hallucination. They have no ability to go do async work yet. I mean, we're giving it to them, but 6 months ago they did not. And then the person would be like, great, how will I know when you're done? And they're like, I'll get back to you. Or sometimes they say, I'll email you when it's done. So they're really taking this humanized thing to heart, right? But that's not good behavior, because then you're sitting there. And we used to joke around sometimes that your Olympia assistant could turn into the worst employee you ever had, because I mean, we had some users that would just keep asking them, is that done yet? No, I'm still working on it. It's been a week. Are you still, when are you going to be done with it? So thankfully, a lot of that stuff has gone away, but I wrote a bunch of components to try to detect it. And it gets into the limitations of these statistical models with regards to detecting patterns. because what you're really asking it to do is to detect a certain pattern, but you can't describe the pattern concretely. You have to describe it very subjectively. And it just doesn't do well with it. In fact, there's this ARC challenge right now, which is to try to squeeze state-of-the-art pattern matching, behavior out of AI. And there's like big prizes for whoever can get it, because they suck at it. And it's really, really interesting to see if you think GPT-4 is super intelligent and can reason and stuff like that, and you want you to knock down your expectations a bit, just give it one of these ARC challenges.
I was gonna say I was messing around with this ARC challenge the other day, and I was like, oh yeah, like the large language models, they should be able to handle this no problem. And it's remarkable. They can't, like they fail.
It's like their kryptonite. It's like you see Superman like
which is funny because like you give it, like the whole thing is like you can give it arbitrary structured data, and like it has no problem like not reason. I don't want to use that word, but like, pulling out the pieces that fit together of that structured data. But anything where it's like it has no reference to, like, which I guess makes sense because that's how it's built, is based on reference material. But you give it anything like, that it has no understanding, previous knowledge of, and it can't really fit the pieces together, even though like to us it just seems so obvious, right? Which maybe that we need another modality of like pattern matching.
Yeah, I mean, there's theoretical modalities that include like real understanding of the language, but I don't see anyone working on that yet. So LLM statistical models are the flavor du jour.
I would like to just quickly like dive into like, because you mentioned a lot of it is just like, you learn as you go and it's trial and error. Like, is there any like standout pitfalls that people should avoid like as they're diving in, like to just steer clear from doing X, right?
Yes. Absolutely. I have the perfect example of something you absolutely should not do. In your AI journeys, in your programming using AI journeys, you will inevitably write something that loops. So basically, it does a chat completion, and the chat completion will probably call a function, right? To do some behavior external to the model, and then you have to loop so that the model can take the results of the function call and incorporate it into its final answer to the user or to the rest of your system in some way. You definitely want to put some sort of limit on that loop, aka circuit breaker, because you can rack up a huge bill very, very fast if you make a mistake there, where it just continues calling again and again, especially if you have large contexts like we do at Olympia. I had a embarrassing failure like that where some subset of our conversations would just keep looping, and the circuit breaker was broken, which is always bad. Test your circuit breakers really well. So we had all of a sudden my consumption shot up from like 2 deviations, and then I was like looking at that going, oh. And I go into the logs and OpenRouter shows you kind of like tokens in, tokens out, and the costs associated with it, and it's just the same number of tokens in and out, just boom, just like multiple per second all the way down, just filling the logs. With GPT-4. And I was like, oh no. Luckily, the OpenRouter guys kind of helped me out a little bit, but that was bad. So yeah, these things are expensive. I mean, when you're using the expensive models, they are expensive in a way that many of us are not used to. But, because we're used to Heroku Dino costs an X amount, and you kind of know what you're getting. A lot of other SaaS APIs, kind of cost a certain amount, and like you get it. This thing kind of has it's like a short squeeze. I mean, it's got like unlimited boom. Like you're down a few $1,000s just because you've made a bug, in your code. So a lot of us are not used to that. So yeah, be careful with that.
One thing that so you've mentioned journeys and context, and I've heard people talk about training on top of kind of the large language model, which I'm assuming is sort of the same thing. Maybe I'm missing the boat on this. But yeah, if I have a specific use case where I want it to, I don't know, refine or summarize, some of the information that it pulled in or things like that. I mean, how do I get it to be more specific? So let's say that I had text that I was routinely putting into it, and I wanted it to summarize. I'm thinking. Here's what I'm thinking. So
Okay.
I was talking to some friends of mine, and they were. Somebody mentioned that it would be nice if there was something that would summarize the bills that go through the legislature every year in Utah, right?
Okay.
And there's usually like stricken out language, new language put in, and it shows you the context of the Utah code that it's going to modify. And so, it looks like the models that you've built on Olympia, right? It can go and it can read this stuff off the internet, and, and there's a way to consume it. So how do I get it to be proficient at getting through that stuff and then giving me what I want to know without having to go and read the entire bill?
So you might be thinking of a technique called fine tuning. So
Okay.
a lot of people think of training, and there's different ways of making models better at a specific purpose.
Right.
And I experimented enough with it to kind of know how it works and what it's for, but I've found that you don't really need fine tuning for most use cases. Like what you just mentioned, you wouldn't need fine tuning at all.
Okay.
To
I wouldn't have to teach it how to read a bill. I could just give it the language, and it could say, "Oh, it takes this out and puts this in."
GPT-4 and Claude and Gemini Pro, like what they call frontier models. I call expensive ones. They know all this stuff already.
Okay.
In fact, what in the book I call the process of applying a large language model to your problem domain narrowing the path. So when you're thinking about the power of your AI model, one very useful thing to have clear, especially if you're completely new to this, is that it literally knows everything for all intents and purposes. Okay, so the space of its knowledge, the universe of its knowledge, is so big that if you present it with something which is your prompt or what you're asking it to do, unless you constrain the scope, it is literally drawing from all of that knowledge.
Okay.
And if you think about all of that knowledge, it not only includes knowledge of the Utah legislature and legislatures in general and procedures of governing bodies, it also includes legislative bodies and governing procedures of science fiction novels, just to give you just kind of a clear example of why there's a problem here, right? So multiply that 10 times, a near infinite amount of different, depending on how general what you're asking it to do, it could draw upon way more than what you want it to.
Okay.
So what I call narrowing the path is what probably essentially what you mean by training. But that's you figuring out what constraints to give it. And one of the main ways you can give it a constraint, which is the most popular way right now, is called retrieval augmented generation. So if you're dealing in factual data, let's call nonfiction. If you're in a nonfiction domain, so your legislature example is a case of that.
You could make. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, I guess so. But, I didn't say non-fantasy, but nonfiction.
Yeah.
So you can tell the model like, hey, you're going to operate on, you're going to generate output based on this specific content that I give you. Okay. And you add that content dynamically at runtime. That's what retrieval augmented generation means.
Okay.
Retrieval means you're retrieving it from somewhere other than the latent space of the models, outside of the model. So you're going out, you're retrieving it. So that might be like the existing legislation and then the revision. And then you use structured data pattern, which is covered in the book, to present that in the prompt. And then because of their training, the way that these models are trained, they understand that one of the main use cases that they're used for is to operate on data that they're provided to from the prompt. And therefore they don't hallucinate it.
I got you.
You get it? In fact, there's I haven't played around with this yet, but your listeners might find it really interesting. And if I can't find it in the next 5 seconds, I'll definitely give it to you to put in the show notes. But essentially, there's a notebook. There's a notebook product that my team was kind of geeking out over. I'm gonna have to find it and give you the link. But I can describe what it does, which is super cool. Like you start out with a blank slate, and when I say blank slate, I mean literally blank slate. So you give it a prompt. You say, I want you to help me make a high school curriculum, and it goes, what's a high school? So you have to provide that information. This is what I mean by high school. And then it goes, great, what's a curriculum? And then you have to describe, okay, when I say curriculum, this is what I mean by curriculum. And I actually think that I hadn't seen anything like this until a week ago, and I think it might be new and novel. So it's interesting to think about whether this will take off. It's actually really, really super useful, in my opinion. You're constraining it all the way down to 0 and then starting from 0,
right?
So that the possibility of pulling in other things that you don't care about or that will mess it up are different. So like I said, I'll find the link and give it to you. I forget what it's called, but
right. So I guess the other question, and I think I've kind of inferred this from what we've talked about and some of the other things I've read, but you can have a long-running context, and I know context means something in this world, but a long-running context that says, okay, I've restricted what you're going to run on, and so I'm just going to run everything else through this context, right? And that's effectively what you're doing with your AI assistants that you're providing to people with Olympia.
Yeah, their context includes everything you've ever talked about.
Okay.
With them. So they're able to, most of the time, somewhat know what you're talking about. I mean, this is still has fundamental limitations around the technology, but it keeps getting better. And we're so in the infancy. It's so obvious that we're in the infancy of this. And those of us that have been around long enough and remember IBM PCs and, Commodore 64 and stuff like I do, actually live through the expansion of RAM and whatnot. So,
right.
And it feels like there's parallels there. I had a lot of trouble with uploads in the early days of Olympia because the context was too small. And for the most part, no matter how good my text extraction was, let's say from a PDF, in some cases I was using Azure Document Intelligence, which is a really, really good way of extracting structured info from a PDF, even if it includes tables and diagrams and stuff like that. But then I couldn't fit it into the darn context of the model. It was together with everything else I was trying to put in the context, it would blow up the context and then it would fail. Kind of like running out of RAM. And then somewhere along the way, I don't remember exactly when, Google Pro came out and it had like 1 million tokens of context, and now it has 2 million or more. I can't remember. So in the matter of an afternoon, I switched it over so that now when you're referring to a document, it uses Google Pro, and it just shoves the contents of the document, which could be like a full-length novel or more. I mean, 2 million tokens is a lot.
Right. Yeah.
So that it just gives that to Google Pro, and then it asks Google Pro the question that it wants to know. So it offloads to a model that's really, really good at doing that sort of thing. And I've seen it do incredible stuff. Incredible. Like I've seen it be able to extract figures from a payroll report, like that had a couple hundred employees, and like basically help me do some ledger entries related to moving these employees, expense from one category to another, and it goes into and pulls it out correctly, which is something GPT-4 doesn't do reliably. And as we go back to trial and error, you kind of have, you start. It is its own field. It is its own, has its nuances. It has its nooks and crannies of expertise and things you have to know to do or not do. Like the Google thing, I couldn't have told you before I figured it out.
Right.
That it would be good at that. Right. That was a trial and error. Cool. But you were asking about context. I don't know if I answered your question correctly, but yeah, it operates on context. Context is key. So one of the main things you need to learn is just how to build that context. The book goes into that a lot. There's different ways of doing it. Actually, I think XML will make a comeback to some degree. I posted on Twitter the other day, and I talk about it in the book because XML happens to be a really, really good way of representing data to the model because it's really easy to parse out afterwards. XML in, XML out. I can't even, Obie from 10, 20 years ago is cringing, but it's like, it's really, really easy to pull information out of XML compared to other things that it can give you.
Yeah. It's really funny. Everybody always asks, how does it adapt and to learn new things, or, how does it learn X? And it doesn't.
Doesn't. No,
right.
You have to tell it, and then it can say. It's kind of funny because like the process is like, okay, you give it the prompt to do this, and then you have a prompt that just like matches it with the data that you already have, that can then give it to the prompt again, and then be like, oh yeah, it's this thing that you told me that it is.
Yeah, I don't think we'll get to AGI personally with the current approaches. I mean, I could be wrong, but I mean the way I see it really like, in order to be a full human replacement, it has to really learn on the fly. Like there has to be a modification to the way that inference works based on new information. And some people think you can just brute force your way out of that problem. So like if your context is long enough, you can just add everything you've ever learned to the context. I would happily do that approach in Olympia, except that it's so damn expensive that it's unfeasible, to do it. Like I could I don't know this for sure. I haven't analyzed it very well, but just kind of based on my gut and the amount of information that I know that customers put into Olympia, I could probably fit everything I know about a customer into a single Google Gemini Pro context, which would be awesome. Except every time I ran that, it would cost me like $4. And a monthly plan is ranges from $20 to $67. So we're still orders of magnitude away from being able to do that. When we get to the point where you can do that, where you can fit all the email correspondence you've ever done, or maybe just all the sent messages, let's say, into a single context, then yeah, you got something. But at the moment, it's too expensive.
Makes sense. So I think we're kind of getting toward the end of our time, and it feels like we're kind of winding down anyway.
I'm trying not to ramble. Just be a good podcast, guys.
I could have you on for another hour if you want.
I know. I'm sitting here going, I mean, I definitely have more things to ask, but
I mean, one of the things we didn't cover, which in retrospect I wanted to cover because it's for this audience, is I have occasionally been discouraged by the amount of Python, how strong Python is in this field, right? And like fundamentally, there's no reason, there's no like technical reason why it couldn't have been Ruby.
I hear people talk about the math libraries and the data libraries, and how those feed into training some of the systems at the lower level. But where we're talking about some of these other models, you're not necessarily building those models. So, I mean, is there a reason why it's Python?
Especially when it comes to no, there's not. It's just cultural. It's just It's just inertia. While sometimes I found it discouraging, what I've managed to flip that around to as the eternal optimist is that it's a positive, because there's a wide open greenfield to do all sorts of cool new gems. And you can, in some cases, draw inspiration directly from an existing project in the other world. Like the most, super clear case of that is LangChain RB. So like one of the main libraries that people use to do this kind of stuff in Python and JavaScript is called LangChain. And there's even a startup around it that's made a lot of money. And then this Rubyist named Andre created LangChain RB and just kind of lifted the whole approach and wrote it in Ruby. And that's become a thriving project of its own. I personally don't use LangChain RB because I want it to feel like Rails. I don't want it to feel like LangChain. Like when I'm using these things in my app, I don't want a whole new paradigm, a whole new architecture, a whole new set of things to learn, right? Like I want to apply it to the paradigm I'm already familiar with. But nonetheless, I mean, that's a pretty good example of a project that got very big and very popular very fast because it basically just said, okay, well, that's popular over there. Let's make it in Ruby. I think that there's dozens, if not hundreds of things that could be done in that way. The smallest, kind of lowest hanging fruit is just client libraries and SDKs for popular providers and SaaS apps and things like that. So like Alex, the owner of the Ruby AI Discord, got really famous with his Ruby OpenAI library, which is, used by millions of people, I would say, is probably not a stretch at this point. So super, super popular library, very fast. I've done a bunch of little, client libraries for OpenRouter, for Anthropic, et cetera. Like there's so much greenfield opportunity to just come in and do cool stuff. And that's why I would recommend, if you're interested in that, especially if you're starting out your career, and you want a popular open source project under your belt or, to be associated with, I think the timing couldn't be better for that. Really, really couldn't be better. And the other thing too is that it's not like years past where the scope of innovation was so narrow that if you missed the boat on, doing one of these open source projects or gems, oh, well, that's it. Got to wait 5 years for the next big thing to come along. I mean, there's literally a big thing happening every 2 or 3 weeks. So, that also just makes it even more wide open, I think it's the coolest place to be. I mean, it's not the end all be all. It's not a silver bullet. It's definitely not a hammer you should hit every, nail in your application with, but it's incredibly cool. And again, I go back to this, most of the people I've seen that have objections to using AI in their projects or whatever, they'll say it's a stochastic parrot. It's not actually intelligent, or I can't get deterministic results, or it hallucinates, things like that. And I can tell you as a practitioner with it for last year, that a lot of these objections don't really make sense to me, right? Like I do come at it from a hacker mentality, so it's kind of like whatever's clever and works, is cool with me. Doesn't necessarily have to scale, doesn't necessarily have to be the most pure or correct, quote unquote, way to do things. But when you come at it from that mentality of like, hey, what can I do with this that's cool or magical or amazing or really impress my friends and my grandma, like this is I can't hype it enough, in other words.
Nice. So tell us about your book a little bit, because I found patterns of application development using AI. So is this not Rails specific, or is this not the right book, or what?
No, it's not supposed to be Rails specific. I've been doing Rails day in, day out for almost decades at this point. So that's what I chose to do my examples at. Also, I was very, very happy to lift code directly out of Olympia, because one thing I personally hate in tech books is the car example. If you're doing object, OO or whatever, it's like non-realistic examples or stuff that's super academic or just doesn't have practical applications. It's like, okay, well, one way to prove that something has a practical application is like, here's literal code that I worked on that's in production. Here you go. Here's an example, especially for something like patterns, instead of being all hand wavy and like providing a concrete specific explanation. So I try to do that as much as possible in the book. You could probably rebuild Olympia with what's in the book. I kind of give away a lot of our approaches and secrets and things like that, which is cool. And I'm planning a Python edition and a JavaScript edition down the line. For people who just can't get over the fact that the examples are in Ruby, but the patterns are not Ruby specific. The patterns are patterns for how to use AI in your normal application development. You could use those same patterns in Django or Laravel or whatever you want, Java, etc. They're not specific to Ruby. That's why there's no Ruby in the title or anything like that. And I'm very influenced by the Gang of Four Patterns book, by Martin Fowler's book on patterns of enterprise application architecture, by Greg Hopi and Dave Rice's book on enterprise messaging, or integration rather. Those were like the formative books of my career coming up doing what I did. So they were very influential on me. And I like the approach. I think that they were invaluable for a couple generations of people doing what we do. So that's what I went for. I said I think there's an opportunity here to write an evergreen book that really kind of covers the fundamentals of how you integrate this technology with your normal application. So things I don't go into in the book are, will AI replace you as a programmer, and like all the philosophical stuff around that? Not at all. I just give one sentence mention in the preface, so I don't talk about this. The other thing I don't talk about is AI generation of code. It's cool, whatever. There's awesome projects like Scott Werner's Blueprints is cool, so plug him. Copilot is cool. I use it all the time. I've been experimenting with other things. I think Copilot's probably still the best. But I don't get into it because to me it's not interesting, and it's not evergreen for a book. It's literally just a tool. You install it, you get good at using it, and you're done, and they're going to continue changing it every year, right? So there's no point in talking about it in the book. The stuff that's in the book is truly meant to be evergreen, like it should be good 5 years from now, which is why we're actually going to go ahead and make a print copy of it. So you can get it on LeanPub right now. It's one of the best-selling books on LeanPub right now.
I put a link in the comments, so if you're on Twitch or Facebook or YouTube, you can see it.
And yeah, it's like 400 pages. It's meant to be a good, solid reference book that you refer to, and you should be able to pop it open on any page and find it interesting. It's not the first half of it is meant for people who are relatively new, I would say. The second half is really, like I said before, the concrete patterns, the things you'll refer to time and time again. I mean, when I say I'm influenced by those books, I mean, they're literally sitting here next to me.
Yeah.
As kind of my go-to for I thought there might be some overlap actually. And if I remember correctly, the only one, this is the Fowler book, but there's a pattern for proxying your API. It is called, am I going to be able to find it real quick? Yeah, API facade. So when I started working on the book, I was like, oh, I'm probably going to find patterns that are very similar to the Gang of Four or enterprise integration patterns and things like that. And there ended up not really being that many, if anything. I mean, there's some that kind of allude to older patterns, and API facade was the one that was kind of like very, very similar conceptually to the integration pattern. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, it's completely different. It's essentially, earlier in the episode, I mentioned that, like, when you're talking to an Olympia assistant, it might have like 20, 25 different functions and can call. You can't, at least with the current state-of-the-art technology, you can't give it like hundreds of functions to call. Basically, you're using up too much context. It's too expensive. They'll get confused, et cetera, et cetera. So for instance, how do we do integration with GitHub or Gmail, APIs that have surface area with like dozens or hundreds of endpoints? You use what's called an API facade. So there's basically one function, which is the Gmail helper function, that's exposed to your main assistant. So anything it wants to do with Gmail, it can just send a request to the Gmail helper function. Gmail helper function, in turn, is another AI that has all the different operations.
Oh, interesting.
So you literally go to the Gmail, if the user asks our assistant, hey, check if I have any urgent messages from Charles, the assistant will call the Gmail helper function and say, do I have any urgent email messages from Charles? So it's proxying it.
Right.
And then that AI has the ability to scan your inbox, to search your inbox, right? And that AI has all the full documentation and the prompt directives and things that you need to in order to be able to use that API. Same thing with GitHub. So we have like a GitHub integration, so you can actually look at open PRs and do operations and things like that. So that's like 20, 30 functions itself. Mm-hmm. So you do it with a helper. So that's what in the book, that's what I mean by patterns, right? So I identified that this is a pattern that's used more than once, and should be reusable by other people. So I generalize it, describe it, document it in the book.
That is really interesting. I'm just imagining, I don't know, a podcast assistant that's,
yeah.
Hey, Obie said something he didn't want to say at about 15 minutes in, and it sounded something like this. Can you go take it out? And then it goes to the audio editor assistant, and the audio editor assistant knows how to open up the file and scan and understand, okay, this is where Obie said the thing. And then.
Right. That's the premise of a multitude of workers. Uh-huh. That's the reason I call it multitude of workers, because in your example, you'd have a worker who was the podcast editor worker. Uh-huh. So that, has a specific set of tools. And it just sits there waiting for a request for that, which is why it's reminiscent of microservices, and architecturally, I think you think about it in a similar way.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I want to be mindful of time. And we scheduled this to end in like 3 minutes. We're going to go over a little bit. But this has been really fascinating. I just went and picked up your book. Awesome. I didn't know I could have it yet. So as soon as I went and looked for it, I was like, oh, I'm buying that sucker. So, yes, it is mine. It is on my computer. So
awesome.
Yeah. So I'm going to go ahead and move us to picks. Before we do that, though, Obie, if people want to connect with you on this stuff, I see you all the time on the Ruby AI Builders Discord, and I'll get a link in there for that. But are there other good places to find you?
Just usual Twitter, Obie Fernandez at Gmail if you want to email me. The product is Olympia.chat. We got a little community of users there. Yeah, that's pretty much it. I mean, some of my other channel, like if you find me on Instagram and stuff, it's all going to be my music career stuff. So, I mean, if you're interested, if you like electronic music, look me up on Spotify, Obie Fernandez. I just recently made a spreadsheet of all the music I've ever made since I started, and I'm over 130 original compositions. So about half of them never been released, but yeah, it's come a long way with that as well. So
awesome. All right, Valentino, what are your picks?
Along the subject of today, I'm just gonna do one pick. I saw this talk from Dr. Jim Fan, who's part of NVIDIA's new Gear Group, which is generalist embodied agent research. It's fascinating stuff. But he gave this talk at the last NVIDIA conference on the new foundation agents that they're building around robots and teaching them to learn using virtual dojos. There's like a very manual process involved in training a robot to do tasks where they have to like do a lot of trial and error of their own to autocorrect themselves. And so they've basically found a way to create virtual environments using like some previous projects they did with Minecraft to like teach skills to robots in virtual environments so that they can do the repetitive process of trial and error virtually. And it's super fascinating stuff. And he gives a great talk on how these foundation agents work. And I recommend you check it out.
Nice. I'm going to throw in a few picks of my own. So my friends came over last night. We were playing board games. And yeah, I think people are pretty used to me picking the board games. And we played Lost Ruins of Arnak. So I'm going to pick Lost Ruins of Arnak. I just pulled up the wrong thing. So essentially you have like a technology track. You have exploration you can do. You can do deck building. All of those things play into your score at the end. And so it's a little bit more involved than kind of your regular game. Board Game Geek weights it at 2.96. But it does say that you can play it with players that are 10 plus. The community says 10 plus. The game says 12 plus. That's probably about right. There were 3 of us playing last night. We had a great time. So anyway, it came out in 2020. There is an expansion. And I haven't played the expansion in a while, so I'm not going to shout that out. But anyway, Lost Ruins of Arnak, it's a super fun game. It's just a little more involved than sort of your Settlers of Catan or whatever that, comes in about a 2. So another pick I have. So I've been working my way through Ayush, who's not here today, but through his book, the Rails and Hotwire Codex. And I actually got a working version of my, I'm basically rewriting top end devs because they're just things I want different, vastly different, right? You learn all your lessons and then it's like, okay, well, I could refactor all this, but that would be more work than just, writing it new. And the other thing is I can add in things that I didn't have before from the start, like internationalization and accessibility and things like that I didn't do last time. Because adding that in after the fact, I miss stuff everywhere. So this way I can just be complete on putting it together. But yeah, so he has his chapters on Turbo Native. And so I have an iOS version of the app running. I have most of an Android version running. I just got it running so that it brings up the website in the native view, but it doesn't have the navigation or anything else on it yet. Turns out that's a little bit of work to get that to go, but it's very cool. So I'm very happy with that. I'm going to pick the Rails and Hotwire Codex by Ayush Nuatia. And then, there was something else I was going to pick, and I just can't think of what it is at the moment. Oh, I've been watching the Euros. I'm a soccer nut. And so, been pretty happy with the way things are going so far. So my team, if they're in, and they weren't in the World Cup, and it broke my heart, is Italy. Just because I lived there for 2 years, actually went to a couple of soccer matches while I was there, and I just love watching those guys play. If it's not Italy, then it's usually England, France, US, and honorable mention is Netherlands. And so all those teams are playing in the Euros because it's European Championship, and except for US, and all of them won their matches. So I'm enjoying so far watching them win. I think the next game on the schedule that I'm going to be watching, though, is France versus Netherlands, and so of course I have to root for France. So we'll see how that goes. But yeah, it's been awesome. So if you enjoy soccer, let me know. You might see me tweet about it some. But yeah, those are my picks.
Do a pick?
Yeah, do it.
I've been playing with this thing called Udio. It's like audio, but without the A. Except I think generating a song is like a full song, especially if you use AI lyrics, is just a novelty. I don't know that this will have any sort of transformational impact on anything. However, it's really fun for doing things like impressing your barber, which I did here in Mexico City a week ago. Because he asked me about AI, and I said, "Did you know it can make music?" And then I made a banda sonora norteña, kind of thing about Marcos, the barber, who had a secret
nice.
And he was so floored that he was laughing his ass off, and it literally interrupted all the other barbers to show them in the shop. So it has good novelty value, making operas about your coworkers and stuff. But what I'm using it for as a semi-professional producer is to generate vocals and to get ideas based on my own music, because a week ago or so they added the ability to upload bits of music. So now that turns it into a bit of a professional tool, because, for instance, I can take an instrumental that I've made. I make mostly instrumentals, and I can upload it, and then I can put in my lyrics, and it will sing my lyrics. And I can iterate on that in the same way that you would iterate an image with Midjourney or DALL-E, until you get something usable. And then without getting into the workflow too much, you can extract the vocals and actually integrate them into your music. So for any of you out there listening who, like me, love the idea of writing lyrics or singing, but you can't sing worth a damn, then this is a really awesome tool to use for that. And it's a lot of fun.
Awesome.
So that's my pick.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks for coming, Obie. This was great.
I appreciate it, man.
Catch up again too.
Likewise. Thanks, Valentino.
Right.
Yeah, looking forward to reading the rest of the book for sure.
Right on. Yeah, let me know what you think. That's it. I had something else to say, but I forgot.
No, it's all good. We'll just wrap it up, though. And until next time, folks, max out. All right, hang on.